In this video, we'll be using the graph of a quadratic to find the sign of its leading coefficient, its vertex, and its axis of symmetry. First, let's look at the two forms a quadratic can take. First, we have standard form, which is f of x equals ax squared plus bx plus c. And next we have vertex form, which is f of x equals a times the quantity x minus h squared plus k. Now we can jump into talking about the leading coefficient. The leading coefficient of a quadratic in standard form is always going to be the number in front of x squared. The leading coefficient is always denoted by the letter a. If we look for the leading coefficient of a quadratic in vertex form, again, it's the letter a. It's always going to be the number that is in front of the quantity x minus h squared. Now let's look at what the sign of the leading coefficient tells us. It tells us how our parabola is going to open. If a is positive, then our parabola opens upward. And if a is negative, then our parabola opens downward. Let's look at a couple of examples. In our first example, we can see that our parabola opens upward, telling us that our leading coefficient a is positive. And in our second example, we can see that our leading coefficient will be negative because our parabola opens downward. Next, let's talk a little bit about vertex. The vertex is the point where our graph changes directions for a quadratic. So we can see on our first example, our graph is going down until we reach x equals -3, y equals 1. So our vertex is going to be -3, 1, because after that point, our graph starts going back up. One thing to note is that for a quadratic, our vertex is always going to either be the topmost point or the bottommost point of our parabola. Looking at our second example, we can see that as you go from left to right, the graph goes up until it reaches x equals 2, y equals 1, and then it goes down. That tells us that our vertex is the point 2, 1. Next, let's look a little bit at axis of symmetry. The axis of symmetry is a vertical line that divides our parabola in half. It's always going to be the vertical line passing through the vertex. So, if we look at our first example, that is going to be this vertical line. So, what do we know about this vertical line? Well, we know that vertical lines are always written as x equals a number. All right, so if we have a vertical line passing through our vertex, that means our axis of symmetry is always going to be x equals the x coordinate of our vertex. So in our first example, that's going to be x equals -3. In our second example, our axis of symmetry passes through our vertex and gives us x equals 2.